Well, in the last segment, Norman and Paul did take Norman's brother-in-law from the West Coast, who's returned to Wolf Creek, fishing, and they didn't think too highly of what happened. Basically, while the two of them left the brother-in-law with the lady from Wolf Creek that generally provides companionship for fishermen for a price, they went fishing, and then when they got back, they found out he drank all their beer. And through their own fault, really, they got themselves pretty badly sunburned. Problem was, he had this way of talking to the women in the family that biased them very much in his favor. And so that's where we're at now, is they've had to bring this sunburned brother-in-law back to Wolf Creek and take their medicine, which is medicine he probably should have gotten, but they got it instead. So it starts with Paul saying he's badly sunburned, that's an understatement. The women I was brought up with never stood around trying on different lifestyles when there was something to be done, especially something medical. Most people have an immediate chemical reaction to shrink from pain or disfigurement, but the women I was brought up with were magnetized by the medical. Let's get them undressed, Florence said, backing to the bedroom door and holding it open. I'll find Dottie, Jessie said. Dottie was a registered nurse. Neil didn't want his mother to undress him. And his mother thought we were clumsy and kept pushing us away. Before a situation could develop, Jessie was in the bedroom with Dorothy. I didn't know how a nurse could get into a uniform so fast, but I could hear the swish of starch as she came through the door. When Neil heard the starch, he stopped wriggling away from us. Dorothy was short and powerful, and Jessie and her mother were tall and skinny, but strong. Paul and I stood by the bed, wondering why we hadn't been able to get off a pair of pants and a shirt. In an instant, he was a red carcass on a white sheet. In almost the same instant, Paul and I, who held the world in our hands when we held a 4.5-ounce fishing rod, were not even orderlies. We were left to one side as if we couldn't warm water or find a bandage or bring it in if we found it. The first time Jessie passed me, she made a point of saying, "Get out of the way." I know she hadn't liked it when I had said it to her. By chemical reaction, Paul and I backed for the bedroom door, but he beat me to it and was on his way to Blackjack's for a drink, which I needed too. I didn't get the bedroom door closed, though, before I was to be visited by 3 women. So, soon as Florence saw her boy in red, she came close to knowing what the score was. With Scottish women, the medical barely precedes the moral. She took another look at me. She took another look to make sure that Dorothy had taken charge, and then she called to me. She stood in front of me as rigid as if she were posing for the 19th century Scottish photographer David Octavius Hill. Her head might have been held for the slow exposure by an unseen rod behind her neck. "Tell me," she said, "how does it happen that he is burned from head to toe?" I wasn't going to tell her, and I wasn't going to lie if for no reason other than I knew I couldn't get away with it. I had long ago learned, sometimes to my sorrow, that Scottish piety is accompanied by a complete foreknowledge of sin. A complete foreknowledge of sin. That's what we mean by original sin. We don't have to do it to know about it. That's really good. I told her he didn't feel like going fishing with us, and when we got back, he was lying asleep in the sand. She knew I wasn't going to go beyond that. Finally, the 19th century photographer released her neck from the brace. "I love you," she said, and I knew she couldn't think of anything else to say. I also knew she meant it. "Why don't you get out of here?" she added. "Wait, Dorothy said to me and turned her job over to Florence. Dorothy and I were the ones who had married into the family and often had the feeling that if we didn't hang together, we would be strung up separately. Don't worry about him, she said. 2nd-degree burns, blisters, peeling, fever, a couple of weeks. Don't worry about him. Don't worry about us. We women can handle it. In fact, she said, why don't you and Paul get out of here? We have Ken and he can do anything and Neil is his brother. Besides, she said, I think you aren't even wanted here. All you can do is stand around and watch. And right now, nobody in the family wants to be watched. Although she was short, she had big hands. She took one of mine in one of hers and put on the pressure. I thought that was her goodbye and turned to go, but she pulled me back and gave me a fast kiss and was on the job again. It seemed as if the women had agreed on some kind of a shuttle system whereby two were always working on Neil and one on one on me. Wait, Jessie said before I had closed the door behind me. A man is at a disadvantage talking to a woman as tall as he is. That's so true. And I had tried long and hard to overcome this handicap. You don't like him, do you? She said. She asked. Woman, I asked, can't I love you without liking him? She just stood looking at me, so I went on talking and saying more than I had intended. I said things she already knew, but possibly one thing she wanted to hear again. Jessie, I said, you know, I don't know any card tricks. I don't like him. I never will. But I love you. Don't keep testing me, though, by giving me no choices. Jessie, don't let him. I stopped from going on because I knew I should have found a shorter way to say what I had already said. Don't let him what? She asked. What were you going to say? I can't remember. I can't remember what I was going to say, I replied, except that I feel I have lost touch with you. I'm trying to help someone, she said, someone in my family. Don't you understand? I said, I should understand. I'm not able to help, she said. I should understand that too, I said. We're talking too long, she said. Why don't you and Paul go back to the Blackfoot and finish your fishing trip? You're no help here. But wherever you go, never lose touch with me. Although she said we had talked too long, she took only one backward step. Tell me, she asked, why is he burned from head to toe? When it comes to asking questions, Scottish daughters are almost complete recapitulations of their mothers. I told her what I had told her mother, and she looked like her mother while she listened. Tell me, she said, just before you brought Neil in, did you happen to see the whore run through town with an armful of clothes? At a distance, I told her. Tell me, she asked, if my brother comes back next summer, will you try to help me help him? It took a long time to say it, but I said it. I said, I will try. Then she said, he won't come back. Then she added, tell me, why is it that people who want to help do better without it, at least no worse? Actually, that's what it is, no worse. They take all the help they can get and are just the same as they always have been. Except that they are sunburned, I said. That's no different, she said. Tell me, I asked her, if your brother comes back next summer, will we both try to help him? If he comes back, she nodded. I thought I saw tears in her eyes, but I was mistaken. In all my life, I was never to see her cry, and also he was never to come back. Without interrupting each other, we both said at the same time, let's never get out of touch with each other. And we never have, although her death has come between us. She said, get out of the way. Only this time she smiled when she said it. Then she started closing the door in my face. When there was only a crack left, we kissed, and with one eye I tried to look around her. They had him greased from head to foot like a roasting ear of corn. They had enough bandages open to go on from there and wrap him up for a mummy. I went down to Blackjack's and had a drink with Paul, and then we had another. He insisted on paying for both. and on giving back to the Blackfoot that night, and on going back to the Blackfoot that night. He said, I asked for a couple of days off, so I have another day coming. There, he insisted we go by way of Missoula and spend the night with father and mother. Maybe he said, maybe he said we can get the old man to go fishing with us tomorrow. Then he insisted on driving. Our customary roles had been reversed, and I was the brother who was being taken fishing for the healing effects of cool waters. He knew I was being blamed for Neil, and he may well have thought my marriage was breaking up. He had heard me call the bastard, and he was out of the house when I and the three Scottish women publicly declared our love for each other. Given the restrictions Scots put on such public declarations, actually, I was feeling lordly with love and several times broke into laughter that I can't explain otherwise, but he could have thought I was trying to be brave about having made a mess of my life. I don't really know what he thought, but he was as tender as I usually tried to be to him. On the way, he said, Mother would be glad to see us too, but she gets excited when we show up without telling her ahead of time, so let's stop at Lincoln and telephone. You called her, I said. She loves to hear you. You call her, I said. She loves to hear you. Fine, he said. No, it's a better way. You call her, I said. She loves to hear you. Fine, he said, but you asked Father to come fishing with us. So he made the arrangements for what turned out to be our last fishing trip together. He thought of all of us. Even though we telephoned, Mother was excited when we got to Missoula. She tried to wring her hands in her apron, hug Paul, and laugh all at the same time. Father stood in the background and just laughed. I still felt lordly, and I just stood in the background whenever we had a family reunion. Mother and Paul were always the central attraction. He would lean back when he hugged her and laugh, but the best she could do was to hug and try to laugh. It was late when we arrived in Missoula. We had been careful not to eat it on the way, although there was a good restaurant in Lincoln, because we knew that if we are there, we would have to eat all over again. And if we ate there, we'd have to eat all over again in Missoula. Early in the dinner, Mother was especially nice to me, since she hadn't paid much attention to me so far, but soon she was back with fresh rolls, and she buttered Paul's. Here's your favorite chokecherry jelly, she said, passing it to him. She was a fine cook of wild berries and wild game, and she always had chokecherry jelly waiting for him. Somewhere along the line, she had forgotten that it was I who liked chokecherry jelly, a gentle confusion that none of her men minded. My father and mother were in retirement now, and neither one liked being out of things, especially my mother, who was younger than my father and was used to running the church. To them, Paul was the reporter, their chief contact with reality, the recorder of the world that was leaving them and that they had never known very well anyway. He had to tell them story after story, even though they did not approve of some of them. We sat around the table a long time. As we started to get up, I said to Father, we'd appreciate it if you would go fishing with us tomorrow. Okay, my father said, and sat down again, automatically unfolded his napkin and asked, are you sure, Paul, that you want me? I can't fish some of those big holes anymore. I can't wade anymore. Paul said, sure, I want you. Whenever you can get near fish, you can catch them. To my father, the highest commandment was to do whatever his sons wanted him to do, especially if it meant to go fishing. The minister looked as if his congregation had just asked him to come back and preach his farewell sermon over again. He was getting to be after their bedtime, and it had been a long day for Paul and me, so I thought I'd help Mother with the dishes, and then we'd turn in for the night. But I really knew that things weren't going to be that simple, and they knew it too. Paul gave himself a stretch as soon as it was not immediately after dinner and said, I think I'll run over town and see some old pals. I'll be back before long, but don't wait up for me. I helped my mother with the dishes, although only one had left, all the voices had gone. He had stayed long enough after dinner for us to think he would be happy spending an evening at home. Each of us knew some of his friends, and all of us knew his favorite pal, who was big and easy and nice to us, especially to Mother. He had just got out of prison, his second stretch. From the time my mother stood looking at the closed doors until she went to bed, she said only, "Good night." She said it over her shoulder near the head of the stairs to both my father and me. I never could tell how much my father knew about my brother. I generally assumed that he knew a good deal because there is a substantial minority in every church congregation who regard it as their Christian duty to keep the preacher informed about the preacher's kids. Also, at times my father would start to talk to me about Paul as if he were going to open up a new subject, and then he would suddenly put a lid on it before the subject spilled out. "Did you hear what Paul did lately?" he asked. I told him, "I don't understand you. I hear all kinds of things about Paul. Mostly I hear he's a fine reporter and a fine fisherman." "No, no," my father said, "but haven't you heard what he does afterwards?" I shook my head. Then I think he had another thought about what he was thinking and swerved from what he was going to say. "Haven't you heard," he asked me, "that he has changed his spelling of our name from Maclean with a small L to Maclean with a big L? Now he spells it with a capital L." "Oh, sure," I said. I knew all about that. He told me he got tired of nobody spelling his name right. They even wrote his paychecks with a capital L, so he finally decided to give up and spell his name the way others do. My father shook his head at my explanation, its truth being irrelevant. He murmured both to himself and to me, "It's a terrible thing to spell our name with a capital L. Now somebody will think we are social lowlanders and not islanders." He went to the door and looked out, and when he came back, he didn't ask me any questions. He tried to tell me. He spoke in the abstract, but he had spent his life fitting abstractions to listeners so that listeners would have no trouble fitting his abstractions to the particulars of their lives. "You are too young to help anybody, and I'm too old," he said. By help, I don't mean a courtesy, like serving choke cherry jelly or giving money. Help, he said, is giving part of yourself to somebody who comes to accept it willingly and needs it badly. "So it is," he said, using an old homilific translation, "that we can seldom help anybody. Either we don't know what part to give, or maybe we don't like to give any part of ourselves. Then, more often than not, the part that is needed is not wanted. And even more often, we do not have the part that is needed. It's like the auto supply shop over town, where they always say, 'Sorry, we're just out of that part.'" I told him, "You make it too tough. Help doesn't have to be anything that big." He asked me, "Do you think your mother helps him by buttering his rolls?" "She might," I told him. "In fact, yes, I think she does." "Do you think you help him?" he asked me. "I try to," I said. "My trouble is, I don't know him. In fact, one of my troubles is that I don't even know whether he needs help. I don't know. That's my trouble." "That should have been my text," my father said. "We are willing to help, Lord, but what if anything is needed?" I still don't know how to fish," he concluded. "Tomorrow we will go fishing with him." I lay waiting a long time before finally falling asleep. I felt the rest of the upstairs was also waiting. Usually I get up early to observe the commandment observed by only some of us, to arise early to see as much of the Lord's daylight as is given to us. I several times heard my brother open my door, study my covers, and then close my door. I began waking up by remembering that my brother, no matter what, was never late for work or fishing. One step closer to waking, and I remembered that this was the trip when my brother was taking care of me. Now it began to seep into me that he was making my breakfast, and, when this became a matter of knowledge, I got up and dressed. All three were sitting at the table drinking tea and waiting. Mother said, as if she had wakened to find herself queen for a day, "Paul made breakfast for us." This made him feel good enough to smile early in the morning, but when He was serving me. I looked closely and could see the blood vessels in his eyes. A fisherman, though, takes a hangover as a matter of course. After a couple of hours of fishing, it goes away, all except the dehydration. But then he is standing all day in water. We somehow couldn't get started that morning after Paul and I left home. Father put away his fishing tackle, probably thinking he was putting it away for good. So now he couldn't remember where. Mother had to find most of the things for him. She knew nothing about fishing or fishing tackle, but she knew how to find things, even when she did not know what they looked like. Paul, who usually got everyone nervous by being impatient to be on the stream, kept telling Father, "Take it easy. It's turned cooler. We'll make a killing today. Take it easy." But my father, from whom my brother had inherited his impatience to have his flies on water, would look at me, visibly loathing himself for being old and not able to collect himself. My mother had to go from basement to attic to most closets in between looking for a fishing basket while she made lunches for 3 men, each of whom wanted a different kind of sandwich. After she got us in the car, she checked each car door to see that none of her men would fall out. Then she dried her hands in her apron, although her hands were not wet, and said, "Thank goodness," as we drove away. I was at the wheel, and I knew before we started just where we were going. It couldn't be far up the Blackfoot because we were starting late, and it had to be a stretch of water of 2 or 3 deep holes for Paul and me, and one good hole with no bank too steep for Father to crawl down. Also, since he couldn't wade, the good fishing water had to be on his side of the river. They argued while I drove, and although they knew just as well as I did where we had to go, but each one in our family considered himself the leading authority on how to fish the Blackfoot River. When we came to the side road going to the river about above the mouth of Belmont Creek, they spoke in unison for the first time. "Turn here," they said, and as if I were following the directions, I turned to where I was going anyway. The side road brought us down to a flat covered with ground boulders and cheatgrass. No livestock grazed on it, and grasshoppers took off like birds and flew great distances, because on this flat it is a long way between feeding grounds, even for grasshoppers. The flat itself and its crop of boulders are the roughly ground remains of one of geology's great disasters. That flat may well have been the end of the Ice Age lake, half as big as Lake Michigan, and in places was 2,000 feet deep until the glacial dam broke, and this hydraulic monster of hills charged onto the plains of eastern Washington. High on the mountains above, where we stopped to fish, are horizontal scars slashed by passing icebergs. I had to be careful driving toward the river so I wouldn't high center the car on a boulder and break the crankcase. The flat ended suddenly, and the river was down a steep bank, blinking silver through the trees and then turning to blue by comparing itself to a red and green cliff. It was another world to see and feel, and another world of rocks. The boulders on the flat were shaped by the last ice age only 18 or 20,000 years ago, but the red and green Precambrian rocks beside the blue water were almost from the basement of the world and time. We stopped and peered down the bank. I asked my father, "Do you remember when we picked a lot of red and green rocks down there to build our fireplace? Some were red mudstones with ripples in them. Some had raindrops on them," he said. His imagination was always stirred by the thought that he was standing in ancient rain spattering on mud before it became rocks. "Nearly 1 billion years ago," I said, knowing what he was thinking. He paused. He had given up the belief that God had created all there was, including the Blackfoot River, on a 6-day work schedule, but he didn't believe that the job so taxed God's power that it took him forever to complete. "Nearly 500 million years ago," he said, as his contribution to reconciling science and religion. He hurried on, not wishing to waste any part of old age in debate except over fishing. We carried those big rocks up the bank, he said, but now I can't crawl down it. 2 holes below, though, the river comes out in the open, and there's almost no bank. I'll walk down there and fish, and you fish the first 2 holes. I'll wait in the sun, don't hurry. Paul said, you'll get 'em, and all of a sudden Father was confident in himself again. Then he was gone. We could catch glimpses of him walking along the bank of the river, which had been the bottom of the great glacial lake. He held his rod straight in front of him, and every now and then he lunged forward with it, perhaps reenacting some glacial race memory in which he speared a hairy Ice Age mastodon and ate him for breakfast. Paul said, let's fish together today. I knew then that he was still taking care of me because we almost always split up when we fished. That's fine, I said. I'll wade across and fish the other side, he said. I said, fine, again, and was doubly touched. On the other side, you were backed against cliffs and trees, so it was mostly a roll casting job, never my specialty. Besides, the river was powerful here with no good place to wade. And next to fishing, Paul liked swimming rivers with his rod in his hand. Turned out he didn't have to swim here, but he waded sometimes. As he waded, sometimes a wall of water rose to his upstream shoulder, while it would be no higher than his hip behind him. He stumbled ashore from the weight of water in his clothes and gave me a big wave. I came down the banks to catch fish. Cool wind had blown in from Canada without causing any electric storms, so the fish should be off the bottom and feeding again. When a deer comes to water, his head shoots in and out of his shoulders to see what's ahead, and I was looking all around to see what fly to put on, but I didn't have to look further than my neck or my nose. Big, clumsy flies bumped into my face, swarmed on my neck, and wiggled in my underwear. Blundering and soft-bellied, they'd been born before they had brains. That's a good one. They had spent a year underwater on legs and crawled out on a rock, had become flies and copulated with the 9th and 10th segments of their abdomens, and then had died as the first light wind blew them into the water where the fish circled excitedly. They were a fish's dream come true, stupid, succulent, exhausted from copulation. Still, it would be hard to know what gigantic portion of human life is spent. This is good. But still, it would be hard to know what gigantic portion of human life is spent in the same ratio of years underwater on legs to one premature, exhausted moment on wings. I sat on a log and opened my fly box. I knew I had to get a fly that would match these flies exactly, because when a big hatch like this, or the salmon fly is out, the fish won't touch anything else. As proof, Paul hadn't had a strike yet so far as I could see. I figured he wouldn't have the right fly, and I knew I had it. As I explained earlier, he carried all of his flies in his hat band. He thought that with 4 or 5 generals in different sizes, he could imitate the action nearly any aquatic or terrestrial insect in any stage from larval to winged. He was always kidding me because I carried so many flies. My, he would say, peering into my fly box, wouldn't it be wonderful if a guy knew how to use 10 of all those flies? But I've already told you about the bee, and I'm still sure that there are times when a general won't turn a fish over. The fly that would work now had to be a big fly, and it had to have a yellow, black-banded body, and it had to ride high on the water with extended wings, something like a butterfly that has had an accident and can't dry its wings by fluttering in the water. It was so big and flashy. It was the first fly I saw when I opened my box. It was called a bunion bug, tied by a fly tyer in Missoula named Norman Maclean, who ties a line of big flashy flies, all called bunion bugs. They're tied on big hooks, number 2s and number 4s, have cork bodies with stiff horsehair tied crossways so they ride high in the water like dragonflies on their backs. The cork bodies are painted different colors and then are shellacked. Probably the biggest and flashiest of the 100 flies my brother made fun of was the Bunyan bug number 2, yellow stonefly. I took one look at it and felt perfect. My wife, my mother-in-law, my sister-in-law, each in their somewhat obscure style, had recently declared their love for me. I, in my somewhat obscure style, had returned their love. I might never see my brother-in-law again. My mother had found my father's old tackle, and once more he was fishing with us. My brother was taking tender care of me and not catching any fish. I was about to make a killing. That's too good. It's hard to cast Bunyan bugs into the wind because the cork and the horsehair make them light for their bulk. But though the wind shortens the cast, it acts at the same time to lower the fly slowly and almost vertically to the water, with no telltale splash. My stonefly was still hanging over the water when what seemed like a speedboat went by it, knocked it high into the air, circled, opened the throttle wide on the returning straightaway, and roared over the spot-marked decks where the stonefly had settled. Then the speedboat turned into a submarine, disappearing with all on board, including my fly, and headed for deep water. I couldn't throw a line into the rod fast enough to keep up with what was disappearing, and I couldn't change its course, not being as fast as what was underwater. I literally forced it into the air. From where I was, I suppose I couldn't see what happened, but my heart was at the end of the line and telegraphed back its impression that it went by. My general impression was that marine life had turned into a rodeo. My particular information was that large rainbow had gone sun fishing, turning over twice in the air, hitting my line each time and tearing loose from the fly, which went sailing out into space. My distinct information was that it never looked around to see. My only close at hand information was that when the line was reeled in, there was nothing on the end of it but some cork and some hairs from a horse's tail. The stoneflies were just as thick as ever. Fish still swirled in quiet water, and I was a little smarter. I don't care much about taking instructions, even from myself. But before I made the next cast, I underlined the fact that big rainbows sometimes come into quiet waters because aquatic insects hatch in or near quiet waters. Be prepared, I said to myself, remembering the old war song. I also accepted my own advice to have some extra coils of line in my left hand to take some of the tension off the first run of the next big rainbow swirling in quiet water. So on this wonderful afternoon, when all things came together, it took me one cast, one fish, and some reluctantly accepted advice to attain perfection. I did not miss another. From then on, I let them run so far they surged clear across the water and jumped right in front of Paul. When I was young, a teacher had forbidden me to say more perfect because she said if a thing is perfect, it can't be more so. But by now I had seen enough of life to have regained my confidence in it. 20 minutes ago I had felt perfect, but by now my brother was taking off his hat and changing flies every few casts. I knew he didn't carry any such special as a Bunyan bug number 2, yellow stone fly. I had 5 or 6 big rainbow in my basket, which began to hurt my shoulders, so I left it behind on the shore. Once in a while I looked back and smiled at the basket. I could hear it thumping on the rocks and falling on its side. However, I may have violated grammar. I was feeling more perfect with every rainbow. Just after my basket gave an extra large thump, there was an enormous splash in the water to the left of where I was casting. My God, I thought, before I could look. There's nothing that big that swims in the Blackfoot, and when I dared look, there was nothing but a large circle that got bigger and bigger. Finally, the first wave went by my knees. It must be a beaver. I thought it was. I was waiting for him to surface when something splashed behind me. My God, I said again. I would have seen a beaver swim by me underwater. While I was wrenching my neck backwards, the thing splashed right in front of me, too close for comfort, but close enough so I could watch what was happening underwater. The silt was rising from the bottom like smoke from the spot where lightning had struck. A fair-sized rock was sitting in the spot where the smoke was rising, and while I was relating my past to the present rock, there was another big splash in front of me, but this time I didn't bother to jump. Beaver hell. Without looking, I knew it was my brother. It didn't happen often in his life, only when his fishing partner was catching fish and he couldn't. He was a sight, however rare, that he could not bear to. It was a sight, however rare, that he could not bear to watch. So he would spoil his partner's hole, even if it was his brother's. I looked up just in time to see a fair-sized boulder come out of the sky, and I ducked too late to keep it from splashing all over me. He had his hat off and he shook his fist at me. I knew he had fished around his hat band before he threw the rocks. I shook my fist back at him and waded to shore where my basket was still thumping. In all my life, I had got the rock treatment only a couple of times before. I was feeling more perfect than ever. I didn't mind that he spoiled the hole before I had filled my basket because there was another big hole between us and Father. It was a beautiful stretch of water, against cliff and in shadows. The hole I had just fished was mostly in sunlight. The weather had become cooler, but it was still warm enough so that the hole ahead in the shadow would be even better than the one in the sunlight, and I should have no trouble finishing off my basket with the bunion bug number 2 Yellowstone fly. But Paul and I walked nearly the length of the first hole before we could hear each other yell across the river. I knew he hated to be heard yelling. What are they biting on? The last 2 words, biting on, kept echoing across the water and pleased me. When the echo ceased, I yelled back, Yellowstone flies. These words kept saying themselves until they subsided into the sounds of the river. He kept turning his hat around and around in his hands. I possibly began to get a little ashamed of myself. I caught them on a bunion bug, I yelled. Do you want one? No, he yelled before want one had time to echo. Then want one and said no past each other in the back turns. I'll wade across with one, I said, through the cup of my hands. That's a lot to say across the river, and the first part of it, returning, met the last part of it just starting. I didn't know whether he had understood what I had said, but the river still answered no. While I was standing in quiet, shady water, I half noticed that no stoneflies were hatching, and I should have thought longer about what I saw, but instead I found myself thinking about character. It seems somehow natural to start thinking about character when you get ahead of somebody, especially about the character of the one who is behind. I was thinking of how when things get tough, my brother looked to himself to get himself out of trouble. He never looked for any flies from me. I had a whole round of thoughts on this subject before I returned to reality in yellow stoneflies. I started by thinking that though he was my brother, he was sometimes knot-headed. I pursued this line of thought back to the Greeks, who believed that not wanting any help might get you killed. Then I suddenly remembered that my brother was almost always a winner, and often because he didn't borrow flies. So I decided that the response we make to character on any given day depends largely on the response fish are making to character on the same day. And thinking of the response of fish, I shifted rapidly back to reality and said to myself, I still have one more hole to go. I didn't get a strike and I didn't see a stone fly, and it was the same river as the one above, where I could have caught my limit a few minutes before if my brother hadn't thrown rocks in it. My prize bunion bug began to look like a fake to me, as well as to the fish. To me, it looked like a floating mattress. I cast it upstream and let it drift down naturally as if it had died. Then I popped it into the water as if it had been blown there. Then I made a zigzag while retrieving it as if it were trying to launch itself into flight, but it evidently retained the appearance of a floating mattress. I took it off and tried several other flies. There were no flies in the water for me to match, and by the same token, there were no fish jumping. I began to cast glances across the river under my hat brim. Paul wasn't doing much either. I saw him catch one, and he just turned and walked ashore with it, so it couldn't have been much of a fish. I was feeling a little less than more perfect. Then Paul started doing something he practically never did, at least not since he had been old enough to be cocky. He suddenly started fishing upstream, back over the water he had just finished. That's more like me when I feel I haven't fished the hole right or from the right angle. But when my brother fished a hole, he assumed nothing was left behind that could be induced to change his mind. I was so startled, I leaned against a big rock to watch. Almost immediately, he started hauling them in, big ones, and he didn't spend much time landing them either. I thought he gave them too little line and took them in too fast, but I knew what he was up to. He hoped to make a killing on this hole, and he wasn't going to let any one fish thrash around in the water till it scared off the rest. He had one on now, and he held the line on it so tight he was forcing it high in the air. When it jumped, he leaned back on his rod and knocked the fish into the water again. Full of air now, it streaked across the top of the water with its tail like the propeller of a seaplane until it could get its submarine chambers adjusted and submerge again. He lost a couple, but he must have had 10 by the time he got back to the head of the hole. Then he looked across the river and saw me standing beside my rod. He started fishing again, stopped, and took another look. He cupped his hands and yelled, "Do you have George's number 2 yellow hackle with a feather, not a horsehair wing?" It was fast water, and I didn't get all the words immediately. Number 2 I caught first because it is a hell of a big hook, and then George because he was our fishing pal, and then yellow. With that much information, I started to look in my box and let the other words settle into a sentence later. One bad thing about carrying a box loaded with flies, as I do, is that nearly half the time I still don't have the right one. No, I admitted across the river, and water keeps repeating your admissions. I'll be there, he called back and waded upstream. No, I yelled after him, meaning, don't stop fishing on my account. You can't convey an implied meaning across the river, or if you can, it's easy to ignore. My brother walked to the lower end of the first hole where the water was shallow and waded across. By the time he got to me, I had recovered most of the pieces he must have used to figure out what the fish were biting, and from the moment he had started fishing upstream, his rod was at such a slant that there was so much slack in his line that he must have been fishing with a wet fly and letting it sink. In fact, the slack was such that he must have been letting the fly sink 5 or 6 inches. So when I was fishing this hole, as I did the last one with the cork body fly that rides on top of the water, I was fighting the last war. Number 2 hook told me, of course, it was a hell of a big insect, but yellow could mean a lot of things. My big question by the time he got to me was, are they biting on some aquatic insect or in a larval or nymph stage, or are they biting on a drowned fly? He gave me a pat on the back and one of George's number 2 yellow hackles with a feather wing. He said, they're feeding on drowned yellow stoneflies. I asked him, how did you think that out? He thought back on what had happened like a reporter. He started to answer, shook his head when he found he was wrong, and started out again. All there is to thinking, he said, is seeing something noticeable, which makes you see something you weren't noticing, which makes you see something that isn't even visible. I said to my brother, give me a cigarette and say what you mean. Well, he said, the first thing I noticed about this hole was that my brother wasn't catching any. There's nothing more noticeable to a fisherman than his partner isn't catching any. This made me see that I hadn't seen any stoneflies flying around this hole. Then he asked me, what's more obvious on earth than sunshine and shadow? But until I really saw that there was no stoneflies hatching here, I didn't notice that the upper hole, where they were hatching, was mostly in sunshine, and this hole was in shadow. I was thirsty to start with, and the cigarette made my mouth drier, so I flipped the cigarette into the water. Then I knew, he said. If there were flies in this hole, they had come from the hole above that's in the sunlight, where there's enough heat to make them hatch. After that, I should have seen them dead in the water. Since I couldn't see them dead in the water, I knew they had to be at least 6 or 7 inches under the water, where I couldn't see them, so that's where I fished. He leaned against a big rock with his hands behind his head to make the rock soft. Wade out there and try George's number 2, he said, pointing to the fly he had given me. I didn't catch one right away, and I didn't expect to. My side of the river was the quiet water. The right side to be on in the hole above where the stoneflies were hatching, but the drowned stoneflies were washing down in the powerful water on the other side of this hole. After 7 or 8 casts through a small ring, though, a small ring appeared on the surface. A small ring usually means that a small fish has risen to the surface, but can also mean that a big fish has rolled under the water. If it is a big fish underwater, it won't look so much like a fish as an arch of a rainbow that has appeared and disappeared. Paul didn't even wait to see if I landed him. He waited out to talk to me. He went on talking as if I had time to listen to him and land the big fish. He said, I'm going to wade back again and fish the rest of the hole. Sometimes I said yes. And when the fish went out of the water, speech failed me. And when the fish made a long run, I said at the end of it, you'll have to say that over again. Finally, we understood each other. He was going to wade the river again and fish the other side. We both should fish fairly fast because Father probably was already waiting for us. Paul threw his cigarette in the water and was gone without seeing whether I landed the fish. Not only was I on the wrong side of the river to fish with drowned stoneflies, but Paul was a good enough roll caster to have already fished most of my side from his own. But I caught 2 more. They also started as little circles that looked like little fish feeding on the surface, but were broken arches of big rainbows underwater. After I caught these 2, I quit. They made 10, and the last 3 were the finest fish I ever caught. Wow. They were the biggest or most spectacular fish I ever caught, but they weren't the biggest or most spectacular fish I ever caught, but they were 3 fish I caught because my brother waded across the river to give me the fly that would catch them, and because they were the last fish I ever caught fishing with him. After cleaning my fish, I set these 3 apart with a layer of grass and wild mint. When I lifted the heavy basket, shook myself into the shoulder strap until it didn't cut anymore, and thought, I'm through for the day. I'll go down and sit on the bank by my father and talk. Then I added, if he doesn't feel like talking, I'll just sit. I could see the sun ahead. The coming burst of light made a look from the shadows that I and a river inside the earth were about to appear on earth. I could see the sun ahead. The coming burst of light made it look from the shadows that I and a river inside the earth were about to appear on earth. Although I could as yet see only the sunlight and not anything in it, I knew my father was sitting somewhere on the bank. I knew partly because he and I shared many of these same impulses, even to quitting it about the same time. I was sure without as yet being able to see into what was in front of me that he was sitting somewhere in the sunshine reading the New Testament in Greek. I knew this both from instinct and experience. Old age had brought him moments of complete peace. Even when he went duck hunting and the roar of the early morning shooting was over, he would sit in the blind wrapped in an old army blanket with his Greek New Testament in one hand and his shotgun in the other. When a stray duck happened by, he would drop the book and raise the gun, and after the shooting was over, he would raise the book, occasionally interrupting his reading to thank his dog for retrieving the duck. The voices of the subterranean river in the shadows were different from the voices of the sunlit river ahead. In the shadows against the cliff, the river was deep and engaged in profundities, circling back on itself now and then to say things over to be sure it had understood itself. But the river ahead came out into the sunny world like a chatterbox, doing its best to be friendly. It bowed to no to one on it bowed to one shore, and then to the other, so nothing would feel neglected. By now, I could see inside the sunshine and had located my father. He was sitting high on the bank. He wore no hat. Inside the sunlight, his faded red hair was once again ablaze and again in glory. He was reading, although evidently only by sentences because he often looked away from the book. He did not close the book until some time after he saw me. I scrambled up the bank and asked him, "How many did you get?" He said, I got all I want." I said, "But how many did you get?" He said, "I got 4 or 5." I asked, "Are they any good?" He said, "They are beautiful." He was about the only man I ever knew who used the word beautiful as a natural form of speech, and I guess I picked up the habit from hanging around him when I was little. How many did you catch?" he asked. "I also caught all I want," I told him. He omitted asking me how many that was, but he did ask me, "Are they any good?" "They are beautiful," I told him, and sat down beside him. "What have you been reading?" I asked. A book," he said. It was on the ground on the other side of him, so I would not have to bother to look over his knees to see it. He said, "A good book." Then he told me, "In the part I was reading, it says the Word was in the beginning," and that's right. I used to think water was first, but if you listen carefully, you will hear that the words are underneath the water. That's because you're a preacher first and then a fisherman, I told him. If you ask Paul, he will tell you that the words are formed out of the water. "No," my father said, "you are not listening carefully. The water runs over the words." Paul will tell you the same thing. Where is Paul, anyway? I told him he'd gone back to fish the first hole over again, but he promised to be here soon, I assured him. "He'll be here when he catches his limit," he said. "He'll be here soon," I reassured him, partly because I could already see him in the subterranean shadows. My father went back to reading, and I tried to check what he had said by listening. Paul was fishing fast, picking up one here and there, and wasting no time in walking them to shore. When he got directly across from us, he held up a finger on each hand, and my father said he needs 2 more for his limit. I looked to see where the book was left open and knew just enough Greek to recognize kaios as the word. I guessed from it and the argument that I was looking at the first verse of John. While I was looking, Father said, "He has one on." It was hard to believe because he was fishing in front of us, on the other side of the hole that Father had just fished. Father slowly rose, found a good-sized rock, and held it behind his back. Paul landed the fish and waded out again for number 20 in his limit. Just as he was making the first cast, Father threw the rock. He was old enough so that he threw awkwardly and afterward had to rub his shoulder. But the rock landed in the river about where Paul's fly landed, and at about the same time, so you can see where my brother learned to throw rocks into his partner's fishing water when he couldn't bear to see his partner catch any more fish. Paul was startled only for a moment. Then he spotted Father on the bank, rubbing his shoulder, and Paul laughed, shook his fist at him, backed to shore, and went downstream until he was out of rock range. From there he waded into the water and began to cast again. But now he was far enough away so he couldn't see his line or loops. So we couldn't see his line or loops. He was a man with a wand in a river, and whatever happened, he had to guess from what the man and the wand and the river did. As he waded out, his big right arm swung back and forth. Each circle of his arm inflated his chest. Each circle was faster and higher and longer, till his arm became defiant and his chest breasted the sky. On shore, we were sure, although we could see no line, that the air above him was singing with loops of line that never touched the water but got bigger and bigger each time they passed and sang. And we knew what was in his mind from the lengthening defiance of his arm. He was not going to let his fly touch any water close to shore where the small and middle-sized fish were. We knew from his arm and chest that all parts of him were saying, "No small one for the last one." Everything was going into one big cast for one last big fish. From our angle high on the bank, my father and I could see in the distance, the wand was going to let the fly first touch the water. In the middle of the river was a rock iceberg, just its tip exposed above water, and underneath it a rock house. It met all the residential requirements for big fish: powerful water carrying food to the front and back doors, and rest and shade behind them. My father said, "There has to be a big one out there." I said, "A little one couldn't live out there." My father said, "The big one wouldn't let it." My father could tell by the width of Paul's chest that he was going to let the next loop sail. It couldn't get any wider. "I wanted to fish out there," he said, "but I couldn't cast that far." Paul's body pivoted as if he were going to drive a golf ball 300 yards, and his arm went high into the great arc, and the tip of his wand bent like a spring, and then everything sprang and sang. Suddenly there was an end of action. The man was immobile. There was no bend, no power in the wand. It pointed at 10 o'clock, and 10 o'clock pointed at the rock. For a moment the man looked like a teacher with a pointer, illustrating something about a rock to a rock. Only water moved. Somewhere above the top of the rock house, a fly was swept in water so powerful only big fish could be there to see it. Then the universe stepped on its third rail. The wand jumped convulsively as it made contact with the magic current of the world. The wand tried to jump out of the man's right hand. His left hand seemed to be frantically waving goodbye to a fish, but actually was trying to throw enough line into the rod to reduce the voltage and ease the shock of what had struck. Everything seemed electrically charged, but electrically unconnected. Electrical sparks appear here and there on the river. A fish jumped so far downstream that it seemed outside the man's electrical field, but when the fish had jumped, the man had leaned back on the rod, and it was then that the fish had toppled back into the water, not guided in its reentry by itself. The connection between the convulsions and the sparks became clearer by repetition. When the man leaned back on the wand and the fish re-entered the water, not altogether under its own power, the wand recharged with convulsions. The man's hand waved frantically at another departure, and much farther below a fish jumped again. Because of the connections, it became the same fish. The fish made 3 such long runs before another act and the performance began. Although the act involved a big man and a big fish, it looked more like children playing. The man's left hand sneakily began recapturing line, and then, as if caught in the act, threw it all back into the rod as the fish got wise and made still another run. "He'll get him," I assured my father. "Beyond doubt," my father said. The lines going out became shorter than what the left hand took in. When Paul peered into the water behind him, we knew he was going to start working the fish to shore and didn't want to back into a hole or rock. We could tell he had worked the fish into the shallow water because he held the rod higher and higher to keep the fish from bumping into anything on the bottom. Just when we thought the performance was over, the wand convulsed and the man thrashed through the water after some unseen power, departing for the deep. "The son of a bitch still has fight in him," I thought, I said to myself, but unmistakably I said it out loud, and was embarrassed for having said it out loud in front of my father. He said nothing. 2 or 3 more times, Paul worked him close to shore, only to have him swirl and return to the deep. But even at that distance, my father and I could feel the ebbing of the underwater power. The rod went high in the air, and the man moved backward swiftly but evenly, motions which, when translated into events, meant the fish had tried to rest for a moment on top of the water, and the man had quickly raised the rod higher and skidded him to shore before the fish thought of getting underwater again. He skidded him across the rocks clear back to a sandbar before the shocked fish gasped and discovered he could not live in oxygen. In belated despair, he rose in the sand and consumed the rest of momentary life, dancing the dance of death on his tail. The man put the wand down, got on his hands and knees in the sand, and like an animal, circled another animal and waited. Then the shoulder shot straight out, and my brother stood up, faced us, and with uplifted arm proclaimed himself the victor. Something giant dangled from his fist. Had Romans been watching, they would have thought that what was dangling had a helmet on it. That's his limit, I said to my father. He is beautiful, my father said. Although my brother had just finished catching his limit on the hole, my father had already fished. This was the last fish we were ever to see Paul catch. My father and I talked about this moment several times later, and whatever our other feelings, we always felt it fitting that when we saw him catch his last fish, we never saw the fish, but only the artistry of the fisherman. While my father was watching my brother, he reached over to pat me, but he missed, so he had to turn his eyes and look from my knee and try again. He must have thought that I felt neglected and that he should tell me he was proud of me also, but for other reasons. It was a little too steep and fast where Paul was trying to wade the river, and he knew it. He was crouched over the water, and his arms were spread wide for balance. If you were a wader of big rivers, you could have felt with him even at a distance the power of the water making his legs weak and wavy and ready to swim out from under him. He looked downstream to estimate how far it was to an easier place and to wade. My father said, he won't take the trouble to walk downstream, he'll swim it. At that moment, Paul thought the same thing, put his cigarette matches in his hat. My father and I sat on the bank and laughed at each other. It never occurred to either of us to hurry to the shore in case he needed help with the rod in his right hand and a basket loaded with fish on his left shoulder. In our family, it was no great thing for a fisherman to swim a river with matches in his hair. We laughed at each other because we knew he was getting damn good and wet, and we lived in him, and were swept over the rocks with him, and held his rod high in one of our hands. As he moved ashore, he caught himself on his feet and then washed off them, and when he stood again, more of him showed, and he staggered to shore. He never stopped to shake himself. He came charging up the bank, showering molecules of water and images of himself to show what was sticking out of his basket, and he dripped all over us like a young duck dog that's in its joy forgets to shake itself before getting close. Let's put them all out on the grass and take a picture of them, he said. So we emptied our baskets and arranged them by size and took turns photographing each other, admiring them and ourselves. The photographs turned out to be like most amateur snapshots of fishing catches. The fish were white from overexposure and didn't look as big as they actually were, and the fishermen looked self-conscious as if some guide had to catch the fish for them. However, one close-up picture of him at the end of this day remains in my mind, as if fixed by some chemical bath. Usually just after he finished fishing, he had little to say unless he saw he could have fished better. Otherwise, he merely smiled. Now flies danced around his hat band. Large drops of water ran from under his hat onto his face and then into his lips when he smiled. At the end of this day, then I remember him both as a distant abstraction and artistry and as a close-up in water and laughter. My father always felt shy when compelled to praise one of his family, and his family always felt shy when he praised them. My father said, "You are a fine fisherman." My brother said, "I'm pretty good with the rod, but I need 3 more years before I can think like a fish." Remembering that he had caught his limit by switching to George's number 2 yellow hackle, with a feather's wing, I said without knowing how much I said. You already know how to think like a dead stonefly. We sat on the bank, and the river went by as always. It was making sounds to itself, and now it made sounds to us. It would be hard to find three men sitting side by side who knew better what a river was saying. On the big Blackfoot above the mouth of Belmont Creek, the banks are fringed by large ponderosa pines. In the slanting sun of late afternoon, the shadows of great branches reached from across the river, and the trees took the river in their arms. The shadows continued up the bank until they included us. A river, though, has so many things to say that it is hard to know what it says to each of us. As we were packing our tackle and fish in the car, Paul repeated, "Just give me 3 more years." At that time, I was surprised at the repetition, but later I realized that the river somewhere, sometime, must have told me too that he would receive no such gift. For when the police sergeant early next May wakened me before daybreak, I rose and asked no questions. Together we drove across the Continental Divide and down the length of the Big Blackfoot River, over forest floors, yellow and sometimes white with glacier lilies, to tell my father and mother that my brother had been beaten to death by the butt of a revolver and his body dumped in an alley. My mother turned and went to her bedroom where, in a house full of men and rods and rifles, she had faced most of her great problems alone. She was never to ask me a question about the man she loved most and understood least. Perhaps she knew enough to know that for her, it was enough to have loved him. He was probably the only man in the world who had held her in his arms and leaned back and laughed. When I finished talking to my father, he asked, "Is there anything else you can tell me?" Finally, I said nearly all the bones in his hand were broken. He almost reached the door and then turned back for reassurance. "Are you sure that the bones in his hand were broken?" he asked. I repeated. Nearly all the bones in his hand were broken. "In which hand?" he asked. "In his right hand," I answered. After my brother's death, my father never walked very well again. He had to struggle to lift his feet, and where he did get them up, they came down slightly out of control. From time to time, Paul's right hand had to be reaffirmed, then my father would shuffle away again. He could not shuffle in a straight line from trying to lift his feet. Like many Scottish ministers before him, he had to derive what comfort he could from the faith that his son had died fighting. For some time, though, he struggled for more to hold on to. "Are you sure you have told me everything you know about his death?" he asked. I said, "Everything." "It's not much, is it?" "No," I replied. "But you can love somebody without completely understanding. That I have known and preached," my father said. Once my father came back with another question. "Do you think I could have helped him?" he asked. Even if I might have thought longer, I would have made the same answer. "Do you think I could have helped him?" I answered. He stood waiting in deference to each other. We stood waiting in deference to each other. How can a question be answered that asks a lifetime of questions? After a long time, he came with something he must have wanted to ask from the first. Do you think it was a stick-up and foolishly he tried to fight his way out? You know what I mean, that it wasn't connected with anything in his past. "The police don't know," I said. "But do you?" he asked, and I felt the implication. I've told you all I know. If you push me far enough, all I really know is that he was a fine fisherman." "You know more than that," my father said. "He was beautiful." "Yes," I said, "he was beautiful. He should have been. You taught him." My father looked at me for a long time. He just looked at me. So this was the last he and I ever said to each other about Paul's death. Indirectly, though, he was present in many of our conversations. Once, for instance, my father asked me a series of questions that suddenly made me wonder whether I understood even my father, whom I felt closer to than any man I have ever known. You like to tell true stories, don't you? He asked, and I answered, yes, I like to tell stories that are true. Then he asked, after you've finished your true story sometimes, why don't you make up a story and the people to go with it? Only then will you understand what happened and why. It is those we live with and love and should know who elude us. Now, nearly all those I loved and did not understand when I was young are dead. But I still reach out to them. Of course, now I'm too old to be much of a fisherman, and now, of course, I usually fish the big waters alone, although some friends think I shouldn't. Like many fly fishermen in western Montana, where the summer days are almost Arctic in length, I often do not start fishing until the cool of the evening. Then, in the Arctic half-light of the canyon, all existence fades to being with my soul and memories and the sounds of the big Blackfoot River and a four-count rhythm and the hope that a fish will rise. Eventually, all things merge into one, and a river runs through it. The river was cut by the world's great flood and runs over rocks from the basement of time. On some of the rocks are timeless raindrops. Under the rocks are the words, and some of the words are theirs. I am haunted by water.